January 26, 1945. Somewhere in eastern France, in the freezing headquarters of the Third Army, Lieutenant General George S. Patton sat down and wrote a letter. Not to a politician, not to a fellow general on the front lines, to the man in charge of making weapons. Major General Levin Campbell, the War Department's Chief of Ordnance. The first line of that letter would become the most quoted sentence in American firearms history. In my opinion, the M1 rifle is the greatest battle implement ever devised. 8 words that have echoed for 80 years. Repeated by veterans, collectors, historians, and anyone who has ever held a Garand. But here is what nobody asks. Why did Patton write it? What had he seen in 2 years of continuous combat across North Africa, Sicily, France, and into Germany that made him single out one rifle above every other weapon in the American arsenal? This is the story of the M1 Garand. The popular version is simple. Patton loved the Garand because it was semi-automatic. 8 rounds as fast as you could pull the trigger. No bolt to cycle. No wasted motion. End of story. The mythology treats his endorsement as a straightforward review. Best rifle, best general, match made in history. Ask most people why Patton said it, and they will point to the rate of fire. They will tell you the Garand gave every American rifleman the firepower of 2 or 3 soldiers carrying bolt-action weapons. They will say it was the obvious choice for the world's most aggressive armored commander. Clean, simple, case closed. If you are finding this interesting, hit subscribe. More deep dives like this are coming. But Patton did not write that letter in 1936 when the Garand was adopted. He did not write it in 1942 when it was still being issued alongside the older M1903 Springfield. He wrote it in January of 1945, after the Bulge, after Bastogne. After the single worst month American infantry had faced since D-Day, and that timing changes everything about what the quote actually means. To understand Patton's words, you have to understand what his soldiers had just survived. In December of 1944, over 200,000 German troops and nearly 1,000 tanks smashed into the Ardennes forest. The offensive caught the Allies completely off guard. American units, many of them understrength and exhausted, were spread across 75 miles of front, held by just 4 divisions. Some were fresh replacements who had never seen combat. Others were battered veterans sent to the Ardennes, specifically because it was supposed to be quiet. Temperatures dropped to -20 degrees Celsius. The fog was so thick that Allied air power, the greatest advantage the Americans held, was completely neutralized. For the first critical days, this was an infantry war, rifle against rifle, man against man. And in the hands of those American soldiers, the weapon that held the line was the M1 Garand. The Garand's advantage was not abstract, it was mathematical. A trained rifleman with an M1 could put 40 to 50 aimed rounds downrange per minute at 300 yards. His German counterpart carrying a Karabiner 98K could manage perhaps 15, which means that in the frozen forests around Bastogne, every American squad was generating roughly 3 times the rifle fire of a comparable German squad. At the northern shoulder of the Bulge, American units outnumbered 5 to 1 managed to inflict casualties at a ratio of 18 to 1. That ratio did not come from artillery. The fog had grounded air support. Tanks were stuck on icy roads. It came from disciplined, rapid rifle fire delivered by men who did not have to take their eyes off the target to work a bolt. The comparison to the Karabiner 98K is critical because German commanders knew the gap existed. The Kar 98K was by any measure one of the finest bolt-action rifles ever manufactured. Accurate, reliable in mud and snow, beautifully machined. But it was a bolt-action weapon in a semi-automatic war. German doctrine had compensated for this by building their squads around the machine gun. The MG-42, with its devastating rate of fire, was the centerpiece of every German infantry squad. Riflemen existed to protect and support the machine gun. American doctrine worked differently. The rifleman was the squad's primary instrument. The Browning automatic rifle supported the rifleman, not the other way around. Which means the Garand did not just change how fast an American soldier could shoot. It changed how an American squad fought. Every rifleman was a source of rapid, aimed fire. Knock out the BAR man, and the squad still had 7 Garands. Knock out the MG-42 gunner in a German squad, and the riflemen with their bolt actions were at a severe disadvantage. Patton had seen this dynamic play out across 2 continents before the Bulge ever began. In Tunisia, in April of 1943, American troops assaulted a German position known as Hill 609, or Jebel Tahent. It was one of the best defensive positions in all of North Africa, protected by steep slopes, crossfire from surrounding high ground, and concentrated artillery. The 34th Infantry Division, still stinging from earlier failures at Kasserine Pass, was given the mission. At one point during the fighting near the crest, an American patrol and a German unit came face to face when clouds around the hilltop suddenly lifted. They were barely 20 yards apart. The engagement lasted seconds. The German unit, armed with Kar 98Ks, was wiped out. The American patrol, armed with Garands, had put more rounds on target faster than their opponents could cycle their bolts. Bradley told Major General Ryder before the assault, "Get me that hill, and no one will ever again doubt the toughness of your division." They got it. That engagement has since been called the American Army's coming of age. Then came D-Day. On June 6, 1944, American infantry waded ashore at Normandy carrying Garands that had been waterproofed, wrapped, and in many cases submerged in salt water during the landing. Veterans reported that even after being dunked in the English Channel, their rifles fired. One paratrooper from the 508th Parachute Infantry Regiment of the 82nd Airborne, a man named O.B. Hill, landed in water during the Normandy jump, and his Garand got soaked. It worked anyway. He cleaned it during a lull the next day, but it had fired when he needed it most. Hill carried that same Garand from Normandy through the Battle of the Bulge. When offered a choice between a Thompson submachine gun, a carbine, or a folding stock M1A1, he chose the Garand because, as he put it, it was an efficient weapon that had got him through some tough situations. That kind of testimony mattered to Patton. He was not an engineer. He was a combat commander who measured weapons by what soldiers did with them under fire, and what he had observed across thousands of engagements was that the Garand turned the average American rifleman into something the German infantry had no answer for. Not because it was perfect. The Garand had real problems. The en-bloc clip system meant you could not easily top off a partially loaded magazine. When the last round fired, the clip ejected with a distinctive metallic ping that, according to wartime rumors, alerted German soldiers that an American was reloading. The rifle weighed nearly 10 pounds. In extreme cold, the operating mechanism could freeze if improperly lubricated. At the Bulge, temperatures cold enough to freeze blood plasma in its containers also threatened the function of any gas-operated weapon. But the honest assessment reveals something important. Every rifle in the war had failures. The Carabiner 98K was simpler, yes, but its 5-round capacity and bolt action cycle rate left German riflemen outgunned at every range inside 500 yards. The British Lee Enfield was fast for a bolt action, with a 10-round magazine and a smooth bolt throw, but it was still a bolt action. The Soviet Mosin Nagant was a design from 1891. The German Gewehr 43 and the Soviet S5T40 were semi-automatic alternatives, but neither was produced in sufficient numbers to equip entire armies. Only the Americans fielded a semi-automatic rifle as standard issue to every frontline rifleman. Over 4 million Garands were produced during the war. Springfield Armory alone manufactured over 3.5 million. At peak production in January of 1944, the arsenal was turning out nearly 4,000 rifles per day, 164 per hour. That was not just a weapon. That was an industrial achievement. Patton understood this. His letter to General Campbell did not stop with the Garand. He went on to praise American machine guns, mortars, artillery, and tanks. He called his soldiers unconquerable veterans. Some historians have argued that the letter was typical Patton hyperbole, a morale-boosting gesture from a general known for his theatrical speeches and fiery personality. There is truth in that reading. Patton was a motivator. He told his troops they were the best because he believed soldiers who thought they were the best fought harder. But reducing his assessment to mere cheerleading ignores the fact that Patton had personally observed more combined arms engagements than almost any Allied commander. He had seen what worked and what failed across North Africa, Sicily, France, and Germany. He had watched his infantry fight with Garands in deserts and hedgerows and frozen forests. When he called it the greatest battle implement ever devised, he was not reviewing a specification sheet. He was summarizing 2 years of battlefield evidence. January 26, 1945. The Ardennes offensive was collapsing. Patton's Third Army had driven north through impossible conditions to relieve Bastogne. His infantry had fought through the worst winter Europe had seen in decades, outnumbered and outgunned in armor, with no air support for the critical first week, and they had held. Not because they had the best tanks. The Sherman was no match for a Panther or Tiger, not because they had the best machine guns. The MG-42 outclassed every Allied equivalent. They held because every American rifleman carried a weapon that let him fight like two men, a weapon designed by a Canadian immigrant named John Garand, who never received a penny in royalties for his creation, a weapon that 8 decades later still draws a crowd at any firing range where its distinctive ping echoes across the line. That is the lesson of the M1 Garand. The greatest battle implement was not great because it was flawless. It was great because it matched American doctrine, American industry, and American soldiers in a way no other weapon in the war could match. And that is why, 80 years later, Patton's 8 words still define not just a rifle, but an entire philosophy of how to arm an infantry force for war.